Let's start with it. So, I'm going to talk about test driven development in Android. A little intro about myself. So, I'm a GD for Kotlin and I'm from India. I work for an organization called Misho. That's an e commerce based startup from India. And that's all. And let's start with it. So before diving into TDD or test driven development, let us first talk about test, right? And let's talk about types of test or test pyramid. So as we all know that at the bottom of it there are unit tests, then there are integration tests, and at the top there are UTV tests. Now, for the sake of this talk, while implementing TDD, I will mostly cover unit test because if we do all unit test and integration test, this talk would become a really long one. So yeah, so this is a sample unit test. What happens in unit test is that we test the smallest unit. Uh, Now, by that smallest unit, we often assume a function, right? For example, here we are testing a function, but that might not be necessarily true for all the scenarios. So, if your function has lot of logical things happening, right? If there is lot of if or lot of logical gateways, basically, then you need to test those as well. So that's why it's called unit test. And for this function, if it is a simple, like it's calling another function and does something, or it's just a simple operation, then you are testing just one function. So yeah, here is an example of unit test. Integration test or unit test are very similar, just that in integration test we take two independent units together. For example, here along with the repository we are also taking data store, actual or implementation of data store, and clubbing them together to test. So yeah, this integration test and end-to-end test is nothing but where none of the mocks of X are getting used. So basically, in Android, when we write espresso test, it's most commonly end-to-end test cases because we only mock the API response, and apart from that, everything is basically as it would in an actual app, right? We don't mock any repository or anything. So yeah, that's an end-to-end test. Yeah. Basically, TDD is nothing. TDD is just writing test cases uh, while you are developing. It's a concept like people think in TDD it means you are writing tests before. It's technically true, but not that you are writing tests even before deciding the flow or anything like that. So yeah, let's get into that. It's just as the common conception is, write test first, let them fail, and then write implementation. But if you dive into it, we want to test to fail first, right? Because we want to see them passing. That means after implementation. So to make sure that the, uh, the tests are correct, we want them to fail first. And here are the steps. First, write the interface and design the flow. These are interchangeable, right? You can first write the interface and then design the flow, or you can first design the flow and then write the interface. I believe it's left up to personal convenience and preferences. Uh, and then implement the methods with to do. So basically, if you just without the implementation, we don't won't have any class to test, right? For example, there is an interface, say uh, X, right? Without X IMPL, what would I test? Because I am writing test for X IMPL only, right? So we want to implement the class, and then functions we also need to implement with to do, because we still want the code to compile, uh, because for the test to fail, the code needs to compile. So yeah, and then write the test, let them fail, then write the implementation, make sure the test pass now. So yeah, that's the whole process. Now let's get started with it. So here I have an interface, articles repository. So I'm writing an articles app, where, or basically I'm working on a screen where it will fetch articles from API. It will sync it with local DB, and then it will show to the user. As we saw, there are two functions: get articles and fetch and sync articles. Get articles is a flowable, fetch and sync articles is a single. I won't dive into RX much, but flowable is basically where it can emit multiple events, right? Basically, it means it can emit list of articles multiple times, whereas fetch and sync articles, which returns a single, it can emit list of articles only one times. So yeah, now this get articles should emit from local first, and then after syncing uh, local DB with remote DB, it should emit the update data as well, right? It should ignore empty data and error from local and emit from remote. That means uh, if I don't have any articles in my local DB, it would only emit what we get from remote. It would not emit any error. And if remote also fails, then it should show an error. So yeah, that's the whole flow. Now here, what happens in fetch and sync articles? It's simple. It should fetch the data from remote, save it in the local DB, and then emit the same data. Right. Now, let's go ahead with it. So again, here's the interface. Here's the blank implementation, right? With to do. Only to do functions are here, nothing else. Just to make sure it compiles. Now, here are the fake implementations. Now, uh, you can go ahead with mocks instead of fakes as well. And I don't have anything against mock is really good, and I also use it some lot of times in my tests as well. Why do we have fakes here? Just there are two reasons. One reason is that to make the test code more presentable. So if we had mocks, then test code would increase a lot in the size. So make it more presentable. That was one reason. And the other reason is to make it more easy to understand. So here we have basically we want to test success scenario, error scenario, and data is saved in local DB, that scenario. So for this scenario, we have three fake implementations. One where whenever you ask for data, it will emit data, right? Uh, to You have to while you instantiate this class, you have to pass the data, and whenever you ask for it, whenever you call get articles from this fake data store, it will just emit data. And whenever you call save articles, it will just do completable dot complete. Basically, it would say, yeah, I'm done, without actually doing anything. Now we have a fake safe data store. So what happens is that if you first, if you call get articles, you will get the list of data articles, but it would be empty list. And then if you call save articles, it will save the articles, and then you can get it from this list. Get articles will still emit an empty list. This is the empty data store. Whenever you call, you will get an empty list and completable will complete. And this is an error data store. So whatever you call, you will get an error. So yeah, let's go ahead. Now this is the first. This is the second function we are testing first. Why? Because this function has very simple scenarios, and we are just testing it. So again, what does this function do? Uh, this function takes the data from remote, saves it to local DB, and then emits the same data, right? So if remote returns data, right? If remote doesn't have any error, it should first call local ds dot save, or it should basically save it to local ds, and then it should emit the same data. So that's what we are testing. We are having this setup here, again, just to make the presentation more easy to understand. But you are free, you should ideally have this setup in a before function, right? It's not the ideal place to have the setup. So yeah, uh, and we are calling articles report.fetch and sync articles. And here we are making sure that this dummy data that we passed in the fake success data store is actually returned here, right? uh, and this fake success data store is passed as a remote data store, right? uh, so yeah, it's actually passed here. uh, and the same data should actually be saved in the local layers dot articles, as I showed in previous screen. So basically, local ds, this fake save data store, it actually takes the data and saves it. So yeah, we are not testing the behavior. That means we are not testing whether a function is called on a data store, as is the common practice with mock. I believe we should focus on more that the objective of is achieved through value. For example, here we're testing that the value is actually saved, not testing a function, right? That this function name is called. There's a benefit. What that, for example, if the function name change, right, in the local ds, then we should not have to update the test. Yeah, function implementation will obviously change because the name is changed, but without touching the test, we'll make sure uh, there is no like difference in implementation. That implementation still works without touching the test. We'll run the test cases. We'll make the required changes in the implementation. We'll run the test cases, and if the test run, that means it's working. And that's the benefit of having test cases, that on every change you don't have to change the test cases. So yeah, basically that's why we should not test on behavior. We should actually test on value. So that's what we are doing here. Now this function scenario is covered, that whenever data from remote is returned, we are first making sure that the same value is emitted, and the same value is saved in local ds. Now let's move on to the next function, get articles. So it has two scenarios, right? One scenario is that both of them, or either of them, returns empty data, and one scenario is they are returning success. So in the case of empty, if both of them are returning empty, then it should ideally throw an error, empty results at exception. So we are testing that here. Both of them are returning empty data, and we are testing that empty results set exceptions is being thrown. And here, both of them are returning data. We are testing that first local data is data from local data store is being returned, and then the remote data store. And we are asserting that two values are emitted, or two times the emission happened. Again, first from local data store and then from remote data store. And yeah, we are using this test data factory to generate a random list of articles. And then so yeah, these are identical in my implementation. Sorry, I forgot to add the test data factory dummy article list as well, but I am just using a random function to generate random article list every time you call this variable. So every time you call, you will get a new list of articles. So that's why we are having it here in a variable. And then for both of them, I am implementing or I am calling fake success data store. So both for both of them, we'll call get data. And for local ds, it will always return this one, and for remote ds, it will always return this one, right? So yeah, uh, let's run the test cases and see what happens. They all fail, right? uh, cool. Since they all fail, now we can go ahead with the implementation easily. So yeah, here's the implementation of fetch and sync articles. uh, what happens here? It's we are calling remote data store dot get articles, and we are just making sure it's not empty. If it is empty, we are emitting the same empty result set exception. And if it is not empty, then we are just calling local data store dot save articles, and then emitting the same data we received, right? uh, Pretty straightforward implementation. Now let's move ahead with get articles. Get articles implementation is also kind of straightforward. So we are first getting local data store dot get articles. We are merging it with fetch and sync articles. Remember, fetch and sync articles saves the data in local DB and returns the remote data, right? So it should ideally emit the remote data, right? Uh, and it should also update the local DB. Now here I am not as assuming we'll be using room, or basically we'll be using any DB functionality that will emit data as soon as the data is saved in DB. I am not assuming that. I am assuming I will implement it myself. Even if I'm using SQL Delight or Room, even it has that capability, I'm assuming I'm not using that. Yeah. Uh, so I'm let's be sure that the local data store won't emit the data again whenever fetch data is saved. So yeah, we are basically saving the data. First, we are getting the data from local DB or local data store. Then we are fetching the data from remote. We are saving it to local data store, and then we are returning the same data from emitting the same data from here. And if there's an error, so when there will be an error, when for example local DS is empty, right? Then there will be an error. In error, on error, we are defaulting with remote. So if there is an error, we are defaulting with fetch and sync articles. So on error, we are resuming with fetch and sync articles or remote. Now let's run the test cases, and they pass. So yeah, that was the end of it. So again, what we did, we created the interface, we designed the flow. Now for flow designing here, what we did is that we listed them down as points or bullet points. You can do that. You can design a flowchart. You can design a mind map diagram, and whatever suits you. There's nothing like you have there's no strict rule that you have to do that or you have to do this. Whatever suits you to design the flow, You can do that. And then once you have the flows designed, you can write the test. Now whether you will use fakes or you will use mocks, that's totally upon you, and that's totally upon the constraints you have. And once you have written the test cases, let them fail. And then once you have the failing test cases, then write the code and run the test again, see them pass. And I'm telling you from an experience that it's a great experience. See after working for hours on something, right? When you run the test cases and they passes, it's a honestly great experience, and you are like quite confident just after like within few seconds that hey, yeah, this one works. So yeah. And it's not necessary you have to do it only with unit test cases. Here I showed it with unit test cases. You can do the same with end-to-end test cases or UI test cases or instrumented test cases or even integration test cases as well. Whatever is your requirement, right? You can do that. And yeah, that would be all. And if there is any question, I would take that now. Is there any questions?
Sweet. Well, firstly, thank you very much. That was wonderful. I'm
Thanks.
Yeah. So we have for anybody who doesn't know, Rivu has never actually been given a tour of how AirMeet works, so I'm gonna guide him through now. There's there's a Q&A section on the right. So it's next to chats. I have two questions. If anybody else wants to put a question in, please feel free to.
Yeah,
Um,
what are some best practices to keep in mind while defining a fake, right? That's a very good question. So, what I do is that I check all the scenarios, right? For example, here there were three scenarios. One was success, second was the data was getting saved, and third was error or empty, right? Now it's easy to mix them up, right? For example, it's easy to mix the success one with the saving one, right? It's getting success, right? While saving the data also it will get success, so it's easy to mix them up. But why did I keep separated is because uh, I for success data store I always want that fake implementation to return what I pass in its constructor, right? So uh, for save, if implement the save there only, what would happen if I once we call, if we are using that for local ds, once we call it for local ds.save, that would actually change the data, and we don't want that, right? That's why we are having separate implementation for success and save. And you should always design like when you know the flow, right? You would have for each scenario you should have separate fake implementation. Now that's only my personal opinion, or that's what I do. uh, Different people might have different opinions, and that's totally okay. uh,
interesting. Interesting. Okay, I'm gonna mark that as answered. Um, uh, Zhao, I hopefully pronouncing the name correctly. I asked a question there.
Do you think this approach could also be used for UI feature test? Any specific and special tips for this? Yeah, this approach can also be used for UI. I don't follow this for UI that much time, right? Mostly because for most of the project I have worked in, they don't have proper test coverage on UI. So yeah, on UI it makes it a little complicated sometimes unless you have a good test coverage. If you have good test coverage on UI test cases, then you can easily do it. Uh, and it would be same, right? You will first basically create the buttons and whatever you need, and then write the test cases without actually adding any functionality to those buttons or to those interactive UI elements, right? You will write the test cases, and then you make them fail, and then you basically implement what it is needed, right? For example, if you are writing an animation, right, you are animating something. You first have a element that you want to animate. You write the test cases for that, that it animates in this way, and once they fail, you implement the animation and see them passing. So yeah, this approach works for UI tests as well.
Sweet. I
And
have another question.
yeah, from a test maintainability perspective, what are your thoughts on co-test for nested test naming versus traditional at the test function? So basically, I prefer nested test naming. And to be honest, I spent a lot of time on Spake. I gave a lot of talks on Spake as well. I really like Spake in terms of the DSL, right? Uh, why I have stopped using Spake is because its unreliability in production grade projects, or any projects, the test become a lot flaky with Spake, what I believe. Sometimes they will run, like tests are completely fine, but sometimes they will run, sometimes there will be compilation issues, and that's why the whole build will fail, right? Mm, just for Spec. So yeah, that's why I stopped using Spec, and here I used at the test function, just so that everyone will have it easier to understand. But yeah, core test is also really good, and I prefer having it nested. And is there yeah, there's another question. Yeah, from TD perspective or just testing in general, is there a specific benefit to using interfaces and the class name? No, no. It has nothing to do with TDD or testing. Uh, and to be honest, I don't prefer IMPL myself. I What I prefer is that for interface I used I in front, and for implementation I just keep it. For example, for this articles repository, right? Uh, I would keep I articles repository as the interface, and the implementation will be just articles repository. Now, for this session, I use the common practice just so that people will have easier time to understand. And it has nothing to do with TDD perspective or testing in general. It's completely on the preferences of you and your team. Yeah. Cool. There's another question. For example, if I have
Oh,
a view model uh, in, uh, in which I want to implement unit testing on live data variables, what's your suggestion creating a test class with a generic data type or individual one for each response type? Uh, I'm not sure I understand your question properly. So, you have live data returning different, like you have multiple live data. If that's the case, yeah, test class with generic data type. Now, see, whatever library you are returning, you will need to use that type only. And what I prefer for view models is state class, right? So view model would have only one live data that returns the state for that particular view model, right? So for me it's like easier that you have on the test class, you will only access that particular state data class. But if you are multiple people prefer returning that, for error there is one live data, for success there is one live data. If you do that, then you can have that as well, individual one for a response type. It also works. It has nothing to do with testing. Again, it's on preference, and both are easily testable. Both are testable, like easily. So yeah, It's on preference, and I prefer, if you ask for my preference, I prefer a generic state class. So yeah, I hope I was able to answer your question.
Perfect. Anybody else has additional questions? I'll give you another couple seconds to write it. Um, but Riva, that was wonderful. Are you going to go back straight to bed?
Thanks. Yeah, yeah, I came from bed to here and I'm returning to bed straight.
Okay, well then, let's call that a wrap. Thank you so much for waking up for
Thanks so
this and
much.
for filling in
Thanks,
for Ed. This was
thanks for
wonderful.
having me.
All right, take
Bye.
care.